Welcome to People, Places, Planet Pod, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to ensure a healthy environment, prosperous economies, and vibrant communities founded on the rule of law.
Welcome to Is the U.S. Government Ready for the Climate Crisis? Examining federal, state, and local climate adaptation, an episode of the Environmental Law Institute's People, Places, Planet podcast. My name is Cynthia Harris, staff attorney and director of tribal programs at the Environmental Law Institute, where we make law work for people, places, and the planet. 120-degree Fahrenheit temperatures in Canada, deadly flooding in central China and Europe, record drought and unprecedented wildfires across the western United States. It's official. Climate change isn't the future. It's here now. Climate change impacts, often talked about as not happening until the middle or end of the century, have arrived early on our doorstep, just like an overeager guest while the host is still in the shower. How ready are we in the United States for this unwelcome visitor, whom we have admittedly invited, pumping carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the dawn of the industrial age? How prepared are we to adapt to the climate change impacts we're already experiencing at every level of government? We're very fortunate to be joined today by three experts on the topic. Dr. Berit Ristroff of Ristroff Law, Planning and Research, where she serves tribes, communities, and agencies on matters related to natural resources, hazard mitigation, government, and climate change adaptation. Katie Speedy-O'Leary, Senior Associate at Georgetown Climate Center, who conducts legal and policy analysis on adaptation and is lead author of the Climate Center's Managed Retreat Toolkit. And Jennifer Lee, staff attorney and adjunct professor at the Harrison Institute for Public Law, Georgetown University Law Center, where she leads the Institute's work on climate adaptation, housing, and human rights. All three attorneys are co-authors on the climate change chapter for the most recent edition of ELI's own legal treatise, Law of Environmental Protection, where they tackle the topic of adaptation at the federal, state, and local levels. Berit, Katie, and Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us here today. Could each of you give a snapshot on your background and the work you're doing right now on these issues? Jennifer, would you like to start?
Cynthia, thanks for having us today. It's really great to be here. By way of background, I guess I'm a human rights lawyer by training, and I kind of stumbled my way into climate change by looking at the intersections between the two, human rights and climate. And I think it's that background that has really influenced my interest in focusing on kind of the human face of climate change impacts, particularly our frontline communities that are hit first and hardest and have the least resources to adapt and recover. In my current role, I teach a policy clinic that works on many things, but including climate adaptation and community development, which are my primary focus areas. And at the Harrison Institute, we also work closely with our sister institute just down the hall or down the street now at the Georgetown Climate Center, where Katie Speedy-O'Leary is a colleague. And we have collaborated on managed retreat and equitable adaptation, looking specifically at issues like how do we prepare receiving communities or places that will be absorbing populations displaced by climate change impacts, whether it's wildfires or sea level rise. And an increasingly important focus of my work has been looking at and doing community engagement on the ground, working with frontline populations and historically disenfranchised communities to help ensure that their self-determined priorities are centered in the local decision-making around climate change.
Thank you, Jennifer. So really where the rubber meets the road in terms of these impacts. And you just gave us the perfect lead in for Katie.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you so much, Cynthia, for having us today. I'm excited. This is my first podcast on an important topic. So Cynthia, as you mentioned, I work at Georgetown Climate Center. We're a nonprofit, non-advocacy-based organization affiliated with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. We serve as a climate law and policy resource for states and communities confronting different impacts from climate change. I work on our adaptation team, and I do two main things. First, I lead our coastal adaptation and resilience work, and on that front, a lot of our work over the past 2 years has been focused on managed retreat as Jennifer alluded to, which is sort of one of 3 possible coastal adaptation solutions, which really gets policymakers and communities thinking about opportunities to maybe require or voluntarily disengage from development in vulnerable flood impacted areas, and thinking about transitions for people and ecosystems to higher ground, safer areas away from these flood impacted and prone areas. We released an online toolkit that Cynthia mentioned last year, which is an online resource that looks at different legal and planning tools and policy considerations that state and local decision makers can think about if they're working with communities on assessing potential options to adapt to climate change. So that's one big bucket of my work. The second is I'm fortunate to work a lot on state level adaptation. To that end, the Climate Center serves as a neutral convener for over 20 states across the country. I think we're now approaching 30 through a peer learning and networking forum we have called the State Policy Forum, which engages states and people who work in agencies and governors' offices on adaptation and resilience through different networks and forums like bi-monthly webinars. And we also maintain different online tools and resources, including our state adaptation progress tracker, which gives a snapshot of how states are adapting to climate change across the country, which was a really important resource that fed into the work for the chapter for this legal treatise.
Thank you, Katie. And I'll mention for our listeners that these are really terrific resources that I certainly take advantage of a lot. So we'll introduce now Barrett to take us to the federal level.
Hi, everyone. This is Barrett Ristroff. Thank you so much for including me today. I was one of the people who worked on the federal part of the climate change adaptation along with A.R. Siders, who's not here with us today. Well, I do a wide variety of work. Some of it is law, a lot of it is planning, a lot of it is just weird stuff. But the part that's most relevant to what we're talking about today with climate change is my work with some of the tribes in Alaska, including the village of Newtok, which is completely relocating to a new site due to permafrost melt and erosion destroying its current village. I also work with a large umbrella organization in the interior of Alaska, starting up a climate change adaptation department there. And my biggest interest really in climate change adaptation is getting on the ground and doing stuff, because there's certainly a lot of talk, a lot of information gathering, a lot of plans being issued. But when the rubber meets the road and you're trying to actually get money to move a house that's falling in the water, all the research in the world doesn't seem to be as useful as you'd like it to be. So a lot of my work is very unglamorous. It's contracts related to construction. It's making sure that people are following the procurement policies for the contractor they hire and that sort of stuff. It's really the unglamorous part of climate change adaptation. But I'm also thrilled when I get to have some kind of more distant, safe in the office kind of research to do that involves climate change adaptation. So it was really a joy to work with Siders and the rest of you on this part of the climate change adaptation chapter.
Thank you, Barrett. I think you bring up a topic we might discuss later, the so-called analysis paralysis when it comes to actually acting on climate adaptation, which brings us to a really important point, which is defining for our listeners what exactly we mean when we say the word adaptation. So we'll borrow from the 2018 National Climate Assessment, where adaptation refers to actions taken at the individual, local, regional, and national levels to reduce risk from current and future climate conditions. So since we have 3 legal experts, let's dive right into it. Could each of you lay out for our listeners the legal framework, asterisk such as it is, for each level of government? And let's start with federal with Barrett, move on to state, and then go to local.
Sure. In terms of the legal framework for adaptation at the federal level, there is not some big adaptation law or the Climate Change Adaptation Agency. What there are, however, are many agencies and many laws and programs that are relevant to climate change adaptation. They're just not called adaptation. And one that I think of a lot, and probably most listeners are familiar with, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Usually they're doing work after the fact, after the disasters that are aggravated by climate change. I'm here in Louisiana today, and we just had Hurricane Ida. And so FEMA has been cleaning up after that. But they also have some programs that are more adaptive, trying to prevent some of the damage, such as the hazard mitigation program. But that's just one element, the FEMA element. When you think about adaptation, there's thinking about construction and houses and resources in the land and wildlife and the Army Corps working on erosion issues. So it's a very broad landscape of agencies that's outlined in this chapter, and it's a struggle just to get it down to the key agencies.
What about on the state level, Katie? Because we're talking about different levels of government either working separately or coordinating.
Absolutely. And I think you'll hear a lot of us today on the need for a coordinated approach across all levels of government. But at the same time, each level of government and down to communities themselves play an important and distinct role that has to be considered separately as well. At the state level, thinking about how states are adapting to climate change across the country, there's really no one size fits all approach. In terms of the actors at the state level, there may be a call to adapt or pursue resilient strategies either inside or outside of a disaster recovery context, either from the governor in a state, a state legislature, or both. Or sometimes there's even examples of state agencies taking their own impetus or action around adaptation and resilience outside of that executive or legislative sort of leadership role. What I will say, though, is that even though there's no one-size-fits-all approach to state adaptation, there are some commonalities in terms of areas in which states are working. So first, I would say one increasingly common way that states are working on adaptation and resilience is to form some type of governance structure or body that often works across different agencies. And this could be situated within like a governor's cabinet or sort of work more at the interagency level. In addition, planning is really a critical element to sort of set a vision or a strategic plan for how states might approach adaptation. I think this happens in two primary ways. So first, states are increasingly coming up with what they might call their climate adaptation plan, or has various names across agencies, an action plan, a strategy. States even personalize some of these, like Rhode Island's is Resilient Rhody. Maine has one called Maine Won't Wait. But this really sets sort of the statewide strategy across different climate impacts and sectors like infrastructure, natural resilience, housing, for how a state might outline goals and objectives for how it wants to tackle climate change. The other main type of planning that we're seeing states tackle is thinking about maybe sector-specific plans or plans that are more specifically focused on a specific type of climate impact like flooding to help guide actions within a specific agency or across agency in terms of how that should be approached. In addition to thinking about the legal framework, sort of these commonality pieces, states are also looking at ways to improve permitting programs for new development or redevelopment, especially in a disaster context, and funding programs where states are providing some or all of the source funding for different types of projects that are occurring at the local level, and trying to interject either climate considerations from a procedural perspective, so maybe mandating that project proponents for new permits have to consider climate impacts when they're constructing a new road or a new home in a climate vulnerable area, and how might that impact sort of the siting and design of new development. Or ultimately requiring that certain types of things happen through new permitting and funding programs. For example, like maybe buildings have to be built to a certain height above sort of how flood levels are measured in a given floodplain. So it could be sort of mandatory from a procedural perspective, what do I have to consider, versus mandatory from a perspective of what do you actually have to do if you want to get a permit or if you want to get funding. In addition to thinking about permitting and funding, I think the other critical way that states are looking at to adapt to climate change is by providing funding and other type of support for local governments in partnership with one another. And that can be either through increasing authorities for local government to do certain actions like land use and zoning, or requiring that local governments take certain actions so there's a minimum consistent level of what you might call adaptation or resilience across state and local governments. And then there's also opportunities to think about providing funding opportunities through grant programs, technical assistance through things like data. And so really just looking at the myriad ways that states can support local government, even though it's ultimately coming within this state legal framework.
And that's very helpful, Katie, in terms of state rules, both in terms of direct regulation, hands-on, as well as funding for local governments. And on that note, I'd like to get Jennifer's insights into what role local governments can or do play. It sounds like they have a lot of opportunity, but might also be limited in what they can do.
Yeah, so I promise this is not a conspiracy between the three of us, but I will co-sign both Barrett and Katie to say that, like at the federal and state levels, there is no standard legal framework, so to speak, for local governments. And I should mention that when we speak about local governments, we are meaning counties and municipalities or townships or subunits of the state specifically. And that's because, local government authority differs across jurisdictions. I do not want to get into the nitty gritty of home rule versus Dillon rule states. But, when it comes to responding to and preparing for the impacts of climate change, Boston has a very different climate plan than that of Miami or Boise or Houston. That's because, one, the climate hazards can be very different. Two, local government structures could also be very different, and different cities have different levels of local authority. So, in the end, what we do have is a patchwork system of responses at the local level, which is largely comprised of different land use measures, in addition to local programs, for example, for stormwater infrastructure to help manage, rainfall and things like that. And then what we see increasingly at the local levels are climate plans at the city level, like you do see at the state or county levels. Despite all that, that's not to say that there aren't existing legal tools that local governments can draw on to help with climate adaptation and to help local governments meet the climate urgency that we're all facing. So, it's not as if a student can go into the library and look under a climate law or look for a climate law book per se. What they will have instead is local land use regulations that influence what development looks like and different uses of the land. That could also include things like zoning ordinances, which designate specific uses of the land. And we also have building codes that establish safety standards and technical specs for building construction, for example, requirements like elevating structures or freeboard. And then many places also have comprehensive plans, or also what we call general or master plans, depending on where you are, that shape the built environment and the physical orientation of the spaces where we live and where we work. But unfortunately, like any good plan, they stay a plan and merely on paper until they are actually implemented very frequently through a zoning ordinance. And then I think, as Barrett and Katie might have mentioned, climate change is so swiftly moving that it really challenges us or forces us to think more broadly about adaptation measures. And so adaptation or climate change really can't be thought about in a silo. It's not just environmental law or land use law, right? It touches on issues of public health and transportation, education. And I think that is kind of the responsibility for, for local policy makers and decision makers, local, state, and federal, moving forward when we confront issues of climate change.
Listening to the three of you, I'm forming a picture of a jigsaw puzzle with several pieces missing, looking at federal, state, and local, where there's not really a comprehensive federal program, and some states and local governments are further along than others. So now that we have a bit of a snapshot on where we are in each of these levels, I'd like to start again with Barrett, getting that 30,000-foot view.
Sure, thank you. I did my dissertation on this theme, and I kind of walked into it thinking, well, we need a national climate change adaptation agency and relocation agency. That's kind of where I started. But at the end of it, after realizing there's already so many agencies doing adaptation, I kind of backed away from that, thought that there should be the climate change agency. And I'm actually more inclined with, and I think this is what others may say too, better coordination between them. What is the ideal law? We have an executive order from President Biden at January 27th of this year. Now that would be ideal if something like this would really work, and if the task force that it calls for in Section 203 is something more than a task force. They usually get lost in the halls of bureaucracy. But this does call for a task force among all the agencies who are doing things with climate change. And And if they really could meet and be more coordinated on this, if this task force could truly coordinate it, that would be great. That would go with my thinking of we need to mainstream climate change adaptation into everything we do, rather than having one agency sit in a tower and kind of dictate what to do. So I would be great if this task force becomes something that's really going to work and really going to touch base with all of the agencies, make sure they're mainstreaming climate change adaptation, also be a point of contact for the public and for states and localities, because most people have no idea where to turn. Any community trying to relocate has no idea what to do. There's no path. So if a task force or some other thing like this could help the public, help the states and localities with a roadmap, give them some guidance that they could use, and they could choose to enact that kind of guidance, or give them a floor, which then the states and the localities could build on, that would be ideal.
And Barrett, you forgot to mention the czar. We're very big on appointing czars in federal government when we need someone to take charge of something, right?
Czars and task force, but I just don't, I mean, like I said, they usually, the czar gets sent off to a tower and then you don't hear from him again.
Katie, what are your thoughts when it comes to state level?
Sure. So I think states can play a really critical role in looking at sort of the federal, state, local government, and then community scheme of how you can address adaptation and resilience. And I can say, before coming to the Climate Center, I worked for the federal government, and you sometimes get this perception of like the federal government is really powerful and you forget about state and local authorities. And having the opportunity to work at the Climate Center, I've just seen the amazing work that states and local governments are doing in this space, and it really reminds you of sort of our tripartite system of government here, not to mention any types of intersecting regional levels of government you have. So I think, not surprisingly, states are sort of an intermediary between the federal and local governments, and sort of they serve this unique niche of where they can provide some of the same types of support that Barrett talked about in terms of funding and technical assistance, data, helping communities convene or get templates for how they might approach something, sort of what are best practices, but they're going to be a little bit closer to the local level than federal governments, and also have more flexibility to be able to address sort of the specific impacts and needs that the people that live in that state have. However, there are going to be opportunities where, states are still one step removed from that local government level. And so I think I look at that as a reality versus a weakness. That's just the way that our government is set up. And I think that ultimately can just serve as an incentive for states to coordinate very closely with local governments and community residents to ensure that the type of support that they are providing is what local governments and communities need. And it's packaged in a way, whether that's like a mandatory legal requirement, something that gives a local government an opportunity to create an optional designation for something relating to land use and zoning, or whether it's providing funding opportunities, is really packaged in a way that enables local governments and communities to get to work on the things that they want and need, and isn't so disconnected that it can't sort of set them up for success at the local level.
This might be a bit of a curveball, Katie, but have you heard, is there any discussion on the role of territories in terms, for example, Puerto Rico, which has been really walled by hurricanes?
So I can honestly say that that is not my area of expertise, but I think that'd be something very important to sort of look at on a territory by territory basis. I know, especially after Hurricane Maria, there's been a lot of work going on in Puerto Rico. To what extent there's sort of been the territorial, or I don't know if you'd call it state level government in Puerto Rico, sort of leading or coordinating actions compared to the federal government. I can't speak to that, but I will say is ideally or hopefully there'd be sort of that same federal, territorial, community level of coordination, because ultimately each level of government provides an important distinct type of support, but it needs to be sort of driven through the lens of local adaptation and needs. And so hopefully they're all working together.
Thank you, Katie. Jennifer, when it comes to local level, what are your thoughts on those unique capabilities, especially given you made a great point that there's really diversity in terms of resources and just the positions of different types of local governments?
Yeah, but first, Cynthia, I'm going to take a slight umbrage at your use of the word czar earlier, just because, I do think having a top-down kind of coordination role is important, but I think what we see increasingly, whether you're talking about the community level or local government level, a lot of the responses and the priorities for those responses really need to come from the community members themselves, including the frontline community. So it's just as much of a bottom-up process as a top-down process if we have to use the language of hierarchy. But to more specifically answer your question, I'm going to borrow from what Barrett said earlier and say that, local government responses are critical because local government is where the rubber meets the road in many ways. Climate change, we know, is a global phenomenon, but that, climate change strikes at the local level first, whether you're talking about nuisance flooding or urban heat islands or wildfires or, extreme precipitation events, which is what the average person calls rain. Cities are the best position to know what the needs are at the local level, where streets tend to flood, where areas of the city may experience the most extreme heat. For example, in parts of Washington, D.C., Katie, in my backyard, there can be as much as a 17-degree difference in temperature depending on where you live in the city. And that's, of course, has a strong correlation with income level and race and all of that. And we can get into that later. We also know that well-resourced cities have the capacity to do the data mapping and vulnerability assessments that are so critical to determining where the most climate distressed areas may be. But that may not be the case for smaller cities and jurisdictions where the emergency planner or floodplain management coordinator is the same person and wears 5 other hats over the course of a day. In addition to kind of cities being best placed to know or being able to ground truth information, local governments are also the first responders when it comes to climate change impacts, right? Whether it's in the aftermath of an emergency like Ida or wildfire, or providing more steady state services during non-emergent events and making sure that there are resources and cooling centers for residents when you have those kind of slowly trickling climate impacts. And then structurally, as we've talked about, local governments make land use decisions that impact how localities are able to respond to climate hazards. The legal tools at the end of the day then can be enabled to help government implement the different types of climate strategies that Katie talked about, the protections or the armoring and the accommodating and the retreating. And so, yeah, those in a nutshell are kind of why government or local government is so important. On the flip side, cities are hamstrung without funding or technical support to help them actually implement their plans, whether it's a comprehensive plan that incorporates climate elements or a climate plan. And I'll also just add that in many parts of the country to this day, the phrase climate change is still politically fraught. And climate planners have to talk around it or plan around it. And that becomes problematic when local councils are the ones tapped with passing zoning ordinances and things like that help infrastructures adapt to climate change. And that becomes, just part of the matrix of the complexity of issues that we deal with.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I am very duly schooled when we're talking about ensuring that this whole process is community-led.
I wonder if I could just mention the level that some people don't think of a lot of times, just the tribal level of government, just like people don't think about the territories as much. There is a tribal level of government. Sometimes it's got a legal authority similar to states, sometimes not under some laws, depending on what it is. And it can be very different for the over 500 different tribes there are, federally recognized tribes in the United States. Some of them are much larger and are equipped to have some of the resources to deal with this, where some of them, like in Alaska, are just really villages with very little funding and no land over which they have sovereignty. So it becomes a problem. It also becomes a problem because many of the tribes, some who aren't even federally recognized, are in these most vulnerable areas, kind of pushed on the edge and don't have much in the way of resources to even deal with adaptation. So not only is some kind of authority needed to deal with it, also there's a need for financial resources and capacity building to make sure they can deal with it.
And that is extremely important, especially since it's quite often right now that a number of tribes that are being the first affected by climate change. So on that note, what I like to do is I like to start off with you, Barrett, on looking at tribes and federal, and then back to Jennifer and Katie. And I'd really like to hear first, because you mentioned Newtok, who are the leaders when it comes to innovative approaches and being proactive and preparing for climate change? Because I can imagine tribes would be first on that list. And as far as the federal side, I'm trying to think about which agencies are being most proactive, because the one I hear most often is actually the military.
Well, certainly the approaches that work best are those that are driven from within the tribes. There's an ocean of consultants hot to help out tribes like this, and hey, myself included. Some are more helpful than others, but when the response comes from the tribes and the communities themselves, when it's tribally driven, I think that tends to work best. But not all tribes maybe have the capacity to do this. In terms of, remind me the rest of your question in terms of what they could be doing.
Are you seeing, well, I can imagine there are a number of tribes that are essentially being forced to take innovative approaches and pave the road for everyone else. But are there a couple examples that really stand out to you?
There are. I think what Newtok is doing is forward moving, and it took the community coming together and knowing where they wanted to be, knowing where they wanted to do the relocation, and hiring the right people. I think that was very helpful. The Quinault folks, what they're doing in Washington State, I think is groundbreaking. I think, Île Jean Charles, that's gotten a lot of conversation in Louisiana, although there are two tribes involved, neither one of them federally recognized. So again, this problem of not having the resources, and then the issues of maybe, and then you could face the same issue with a locality as well, or a state, not everyone being on the same page as to what's the problem and what do we want to do about it. I think that's very challenging for small tribes and localities.
And I can imagine, especially with the relationship, the federal trust relationship, and as a bit of a segue, I'd be curious to know your thoughts on what more the federal government can do in terms of assisting the tribes, and then moving on from there on what you see the federal government is doing right more broadly.
Sure, and you had asked me what agency maybe is most involved. People think about a lot of being the Bureau of Indian Affairs just because they're associated with tribes. They certainly do have some money to help tribes, but really the maximum money any tribe is going to get from BIA specifically for climate change is $150,000. And that's great, but that money is just for planning and that sort of thing. It's not going to move a building. Really, the tribes are going to need help from agencies to a large degree, whether it's FEMA, whether it's housing and urban development, for community development, block grants. And I think a lot of people in the United States would think, well, why should this money go to tribes? And that goes back to the federal trust responsibility that you may have mentioned before. When a lot of these nations ceded their land, they had treaties, they had agreements where the federal government was supposed to do certain things in return. So it's not charity for the federal government to be doing these things to make sure that they can stay in their land and continue their lifeways. It goes back to some of the agreements that were made with the federal government a long time ago.
Jennifer, I want to turn back to you. As I mentioned, you'd really stressed the importance of this being bottom up, that this is communities that are most being effective. And I'm curious, from what you've seen, are there any cities, towns, other types of local governments that are being very innovative, either with regard to community leadership or more generally speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cities that were leaders in developing the first iterations of climate plans 10 to 15 years ago, you're seeing them now update those plans with a focus on environmental or climate justice provisions. We're looking at cities like Katie's hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, or Providence, Rhode Island, that have been centering social and racial equity into its climate plans. But they're not only just incorporating equity as an objective or a goal. You also see it in the process, in the ways that the plans are being designed, by incorporating more community voices and doing much more community engagement from not just implementation levels, but also from the planning levels, beginning of the process. And then also, I think it's important to center in other priorities that community members care about, like housing and transportation, or tree planting or green spaces, and putting a greater focus on community health, which has a great deal to do with increased individual, but also community resilience to climate and other quality of life indicators that people care about. And then at the hyperlocal level, in cities like Baltimore, you see a focus on hyperlocal solutions or neighborhood level solutions like a resilience hub, which is a trusted community center that local residents can go to during both steady state but also emergency events, and can help them with things like providing refrigeration for their medication or having chargers so that they can contact other people during the event of emergency. And then, of course, Katie and I were just talking about this morning, but we also see a disparity, unfortunately, between urban and rural areas and where resources are being concentrated or focused. And I think it's fair to say that right now there is less resources, I think, allocated to more rural areas across the country. And I think a lot of this has to do with just making sure there is a greater awareness of opportunities at the state and federal level to support rural areas and making sure that there's more flexibility in how federal dollars are spent.
Well, that's an excellent point. And I'm curious, do you see any opportunities for some of these very, very small communities, these rural areas, these small towns? And any good examples you're seeing or any thoughts on that?
I will deflect that question because I have not focused a lot of my research on the rural areas, but I know that Katie has been looking at some rural areas for some of our work in Louisiana, in the Gulf South.
Katie, I'll turn to you if you have any thoughts on that, but also generally where you're seeing some interesting leadership on the part of states. And I believe you'd also written on some distinctions between coastal versus inland states.
Exactly. Happy to follow up a little bit on both. So I think the point that Jennifer talked about in terms of elevating adaptation and resilience, and also I think just general administrative and financial constraints that rural communities are facing is and needs to be an emerging part of a dialogue going forward. We're fortunate to be working with a region in Louisiana, sort of looking at how we can potentially support more resilient, affordable housing solutions and nature-based projects and opportunities for communities in areas that are potentially growing in population now for reasons unassociated with climate change, or that may experience population growth and transitions in the future due to reasons like climate change, as people may choose to, or unfortunately, not be able to live in some areas along the coast. And I think, long story short, you'll see that a lot of the dialogues or examples that people are talking about as best practices of climate adaptation are really being drawn primarily from more resourced or urban communities. And I use that term lightly because obviously all municipalities face some types of resource constraints. But in general, looking for opportunities, I think, to borrow lessons learned from communities that maybe have made more headway on adaptation and resilience, but translating them to a rural context. And that can be in a lot of different ways in terms of differences in resources, geography. One thing that's really important is sort of the connectivity piece of things. So thinking about transit-oriented development, but in a rural context. And so really trying to broker sort of connections between these types of different areas and sort of be able to have that translational piece to make sure that adaptation and resilient solutions are appropriate for rural areas, but where possible, you're not trying to reinvent the wheel and can sort of think about going forward. And the region we're working in Louisiana has a mix across the urban, suburban to rural spectrum. And so that's one thing we're actively sort of confronting and hoping we come up with some, good things from this process that can not only potentially be used and considered in Louisiana, but the Gulf or the nation more broadly. To the state piece. So with states, when you sort of ask about like who are state leaders in adaptation and resilience, I have a very attorney answer in that it depends in terms of how you define like what are your metrics of measuring sort of success or leadership. And so I think ultimately that's going to depend on sort of what you're looking at in terms of exemplars that you might point to at the state level. But in general, I think, we really started seeing adaptation and resilience take off at the state level around 2008, 2009, 2010, primarily in coastal states, with some states like Maryland, California, and Florida really initiating the establishment of a governance body and a call for a statewide climate adaptation plan across different climate impacts, which are sort of those two pieces of that legal framework we discussed earlier. And so I think a lot of that was brought on in particular by flooding impacts. But since that early time frame, we've seen the number of states partaking in some type of adaptation or resilience action grow, and not just on the east and west coast, but also increasingly from states further inland like Colorado, New Mexico, Montana, and Minnesota. And it's really exciting to see, states really take ownership of thinking about adaptation and resilience and what it really means in the context of their state. As I mentioned, Georgetown Climate Center has a resource called the State Adaptation Progress Tracker that looks at how states are adapting to climate change across the country. And based on that one resource alone, there's over 20 states that are somehow taking action on climate change, whether that's being in the process of creating their state's first adaptation plan, or it's been around for over 10 years and they're updating it and have a lot more elements of sort of that state legal framework to be able to share. What I will note, though, is that there's a couple of states that probably stand out as exemplars in terms of really addressing or tackling multiple parts of that climate adaptation and resilience framework at the state level. And so I think some of those standouts across the board would be California, Maryland, Massachusetts, and New York, just because of sort of the level and scale of the work that they're undertaking. People often look to them for examples in a variety of different areas.
Thank you, Katie. This is very helpful. I think the discussions also underline some areas where we can all do some more work and looking what the impacts are and ways to react. In the time we have left, I'd like to throw out a couple of lightning round questions for the group. We touched on some important matters related to environmental justice, emerging impacts, legal tools. I'm curious what your thoughts are on opportunities for cross-jurisdictional coordination, and I'll leave it open to whoever would like to start first.
Well, this is Barrett. We do have a cross-jurisdictional model in terms of the Coastal Zone Management Act, where NOAA is the agency administering this, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it's through an act of Congress, but NOAA administers this, and then states can set laws actually beyond the state borders to address some of the things they want to do to protect and develop their coast. And some of the states let the local governments as well make their own policies. And so whenever there's a potential project or something to be approved, the three levels of approval between the state and the federal government and the localities are coordinated in one review. That could be a model for some kind of climate coordination in terms of an act like that. I don't have a clear view of how you coordinate everything between all the states and all the localities, just because climate change adaptation is, again, so much broader than just how do you deal with one particular portion of the coast. I would like to think that this executive order with the National Climate Task Force could do something, but it's going to take a lot of work at the federal level to really make that a reality of coordination, even just at the federal level, let alone coordination with the states and localities and tribes and territories.
Jennifer and Kate, do you have any thoughts maybe on how state and local governments can work better together, perhaps even working more with the tribes, as Barrett had brought up earlier?
Yes, absolutely. So this is something which, if I guess I borrow from the British, like is a little bit of a sticky wicket. I think there's an increasing recognition, especially when it comes to impacts like wildfires and flooding, that these are cross-jurisdictional impacts if you're defining a jurisdiction as like an entity of state or local government, as Jennifer talked about, being a county or maybe a municipality. But our legal system was not set up to think about cross-jurisdictional impacts, even though, we've had around for a long time things thinking like, natural resources and, sharing of water and drought and those types of issues. So how do you take a legal system that wasn't set up to deal with cross-jurisdictional impacts to deal with cross-jurisdictional impacts? And I think this is an area that there's a lot of discussion around, but maybe not a lot of solid solutions that have come out of it. You can look to examples like in Florida and California and other states where there may be opportunities for informal regional collaboration, and even the location Jennifer mentioned that we're working in Louisiana. There's the state set up these sort of regional watershed bodies through what it calls the Louisiana Watershed Initiative to start thinking about, regional level coordination from a flooding perspective on a watershed scale. But I'd say some of these are the exception rather than the norm. I think there's opportunities for states to provide increased types of legal authority for local governments to think across boundaries, whether that's something that's mandatory, maybe in a transportation context, or it could incentivize them to think about it as well, but wouldn't be mandatory. New Hampshire and Maryland have some recent examples of these, including to think about opportunities to look at raising funds to address cross-jurisdictional impacts, because one jurisdiction shouldn't have to bear that on its own. And also, as you're going to have more transitions between populations and natural resources, this might help sort of compound and emphasize the need for this discussion. But to date, even I think with these optional authorities, I think based on my perspective, there has not yet been a lot of local uptake, just because, again, I think it's the nature of the legal system we're in, and it's going to require not only legal changes, but sort of transformational changes in terms of the way state and local governments especially are doing business.
And I'll mention here some of the existing structures we have, like MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, and then in California, where I'm at, there is a bill, I think it's AB 897, looking at developing regional climate networks. So it looks like there might be some movement there. Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on cross-jurisdictional coordination to add?
So in addition to what Katie and Bear have already mentioned, I think more than just looking at cross-jurisdiction collaboration, we also need to look at it from a more interdisciplinary nature, because that's the nature of climate as a threat. So, what we need, as many urban planners like to say, is a whole systems approach, because the disproportionate impact that many communities face when it comes to climate change, they're experiencing inequity in so many other areas of their day-to-day lives, right? So local governments, planners, decision makers really need to consider a holistic and a comprehensive approach to climate adaptation at the local level, not just when it comes to planning or passing laws and regulations, but also in how they communicate the risks, the threats, and then the opportunities to community members. Because, why should a resident in a frontline community worry about climate change when in any community engagement conversation you have with them, they'll prioritize more eminent concerns like public safety or food access or housing access, or jobs, childcare, and the list goes on. And that can be a very delicate and also challenging and even ineffective conversation unless you're able to make the linkages between climate change, a residence built-in social environment, and the laundry list of other concerns that people have just to get through the day. And one way to address that is it's not just enough to talk to the communities after you have a climate plan in the books and when you're ready to implement it, so to speak. They have to be part of the process. Communities have to be part of the process from day one, to acknowledge that local residents can also be a part of the solution set and make sure that their voices and their priorities are integrated into the planning process rather than be this kind of ex post beneficiaries of climate policy. Because in many places, we see a deficit of trust between local governments and frontline communities. And even if you have the correct programming and planning in place, one is, have you ground truth that with the residents? And two, will you get political will from the residents to adopt them?
I think all these are critical points to make. And since we're about out of time, I'd like to give everyone an opportunity to wrap up with one takeaway or one current development for listeners. And we'll start again with Barrett, go to Katie, and then wrap up with Jennifer.
I really like what Jennifer said about acting holistically and not losing sight of the people there in the process. Just full circle back to the beginning of this, when we talked about what do we mean by adaptation. A lot of times when I talk about these tribal villages in Alaska, I say adaptation is the ability to your physical and cultural continuity, being able to be where you are and keep your life way in 50 years from now. And that requires government and the tribe itself to look not just at the physical aspects of climate change, but also economically, how are you going to adapt? Socially, culturally, political, how are you going to adapt? So I very much echo what Jennifer had to say.
Let's see. I third Jennifer's important insights. I think for me, my takeaway is thinking about progress and hope. So increasingly, especially during hurricane season, there's been a lot of media coverage of the devastation going on in the Gulf after Hurricane Ida. And that's just one example of what we've seen in the past, and we may continually see more frequently and maybe more severely in the future. And so it becomes very sort of disparaging and really difficult sometimes, whether you're a climate adaptation professional or you're someone on the outside looking in, or you are somebody, as Jennifer was talking about, a planner in a community that all of a sudden is starting to think about climate and you don't know where to start. But ultimately, by looking at the work that we all are doing, ELI is doing, and others are doing, I think there's really a lot of impetus and reason to be hopeful, because you can see even in the small ways, maybe a local government is incorporating something about climate change into a plan for the first time, or maybe you see a state coming out with this huge statewide program and funding to back it up so it can lead to implementation. There are positive actions happening across all levels of government, and we need to take that and hold on to it and let it inspire us to go forward. Every action can lead to something promising and hopeful. And I think that's what we need to sort of try to bring to these conversations, bring to the legal profession, and bring to the other myriad of professionals that are working in this space, because sitting and getting disparaged and going into a tailspin of thinking we can't make progress on this isn't going to get us anywhere. So I hope that the work that's sort of captured in this legal treatise and the work that all of us are doing on the grounds and in different areas can really lead more people to inspiration and ultimately bring more action to the forefront of what we're seeing as a nation across all these different levels of government and communities.
I think this is where Katie and I are such good complements to each other, because Katie often brings the hope and I bring the cold bucket of water. That's the reality check that has a silver lining to it, I should think. Because I think it's impossible to have an honest conversation about climate adaptation unless we really talk about equity, especially when you have a scarcity of resources to address such a threat of this scale. You often hear about the principles of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, at the international level when we have these broad-ranging climate policy talks, recognizing that different states or different countries have different responsibilities for addressing global environmental issues depending on their level of economic development. But here in the United States, we need to have a similar conversation domestically, and whether we have an equitable allocation of resources to communities at various income levels to make sure that they're not being burdened disproportionately. Because fundamentally, climate change is an environmental justice issue. It's, most communities who are experiencing the worst impacts of these hazards, whether it's flooding or heat, are disproportionately low income in communities of color. And I just can't stress that enough. Climate change is not some great equalizer where we're all experiencing the same thing together in equal measures. In many cases, these same frontline communities that we've talked about a lot for climate change are also frontline communities in other areas like public health, as the pandemic has so forcefully shown us. With Ida, you see that, you have flooding on top of heat, on top of, standing water and then humidity that leads to mold exposure on top of COVID. And I guess the silver lining of this, or the call to action, is that, as a society, we've never been very good at proactive planning. We've been more reactionary. We act after islands are, disappearing or communities are being displaced and wildfires have decimated entire communities. We will never be able to rebuild our infrastructure as quickly as climate change is changing them. But hopefully we are at a place now where there has been enough of a crisis that decision makers feel the mandate to act and community members see the urgencies of this, and that we still have enough of a runway and enough time to avert the worst case scenario. Sorry if that's very doom and gloom.
Well, you make a good point that climate change is actually exposing and widening a number of existing cracks. So it's a very difficult situation, a genuine crisis involving hard decisions, but also there's some hope and opportunity if each level of government is willing to address climate change adaptation proactively and pragmatically. So unfortunately, we're out of time, but I really want to thank all of you for joining us. Jennifer, Katie, and Barrett. It's certainly illuminating. And we'll link in the show notes to Law of Environmental Protection so you can check out their chapters, some really great work on climate change. And quickly from each of you, where can our audience again learn more about the cutting edge work you're doing? Jennifer?
I would point our audience members to the Georgetown Climate Center's website and the Adaptation Clearinghouse, and also the Harris Institute's website on the Georgetown Law website. So lots of websiting, but Katie can speak more to GCC's work.
Ditto to all of that. I'd also encourage anybody who works for a state agency or governor's office on adaptation and resilience. You can find more information about our state adaptation progress tracker and potentially joining our peer learning and networking forum called the State Policy Forum on our website.
And this is Barrett. I feel like I'm just one of many people who are doing important climate change adaptation work on the ground. You might want to look to Tanana Chiefs Conference website. That's the umbrella and tribal organization in Interior Alaska. Google Tanana Chiefs Conference. Also Google New Talk Alaska. You'll find a wealth of information. If you're interested in seeing specifically what I'm doing, Google me, Barrett Ristroff, or check out my website, Ristroff Law. That's RISTROPHLAW.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to People Places Planet Pod, brought to you by the Environmental Law Institute. We would like to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and ideas to podcast@eli.org. And if you're interested in learning more about our work, attending one of our events, reading our publications, or becoming a member, please visit our website at www.eli.org.